Good afternoon. This afternoon we're going to cover some old territory so we can get to some new territory. Long ago, before you were born, 3 small ships came into the Chesapeake Bay and headed south to the James River. They were told to go up the river at least 3 miles so that no Spanish ships could find them if the Spanish happened to come that way. And the reason for this was back in 1607, the major power in America was Spain. So these 3 English ships sailed, discharged their cargo and their people, around 100 settlers, and they founded the town of Jamestown, named for King James, James I of England and James VI of Scotland. It was the time of the British Union from England to Scotland, making Britain. So they stayed there. Now, around 8 years later, another ship came. This ship was not from England, it was a Dutch ship, and had on board a number of black people. And this is the beginning of slavery. They didn't know what to do initially because they didn't have slaves, but they quickly found out that they could transfer their idea that your wheelchair, Barbara, is your chattel, like any table or any other chair you own, and you could sell it. And so these people were classified as chattel, and they were sold. So it's the beginning of slavery in America. Now we're mentioning that because we're going to get up to the 21st century very quickly, but the Virginians quickly took to this idea of slavery. They didn't need a lot of slaves because they didn't have anything that they could use them for. Mainly they became house servants. But as time went by, in Virginia, you do not grow cotton. As time went by and cotton grew in the deeper South, the need for more slaves was apparent. And this was particularly true when Eli Whitney came along and invented the cotton gin. You see, cotton has a very difficult ball in the middle of the cotton, and it can hurt your hands and cut your hands. And so to divide the cotton, which is very wealthy as a crop, from its ball, you needed a gin, and now we had it. We had a cotton gin. So these people became very useful for people who wanted to grow very large crops of cotton. This is the cotton of the deep South, of Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas, and Louisiana for that matter. And so cotton became king. And it's important to realize that in the early history of your nation, cotton was king. And for the 3 bursts of energy that we had where we grew very rapidly, all of that rapidity was caused by cotton and cotton expansion. If you had any money to invest in the 19th century, you put it into cotton lands. It gave the best return. So Yankee money went south, got invested in cotton, and cotton then became the great crop. Now this is all the ancient history to you, but it's important basic history to understand something about where we are today, because we just had a new holiday created. Maybe you don't know it, but we are celebrating a day where slavery ended, per se, in Texas. And so the question is how we get from here to there. And it's important for Mr. Biden, who wants to get here to there and get over this. He has himself been able to serve after a black man was elected president of the United States. Now, maybe that doesn't seem amazing to Californians, but it was amazing to the rest of the world that the Americans would go and elect someone like Barack Obama with his wonderful wife, Michelle. And we would have this kind of internal revolution that would change the nature of relations between blacks and whites. but it comes from a long, long history of struggle, mainly on the part of Black people struggling to find their place in our country. So we'll speed up. Black people became a majority in most of the slave states. So when the Civil War was over and blacks were emancipated, you remember there was a man named Lincoln. He ran a war. He won the war with the help of Ulysses S. Grant, and they freed the slaves. But they didn't do it in a very nice way. Slaves usually followed the Union Army as it spread quickly across the South. And they were left on one side of the river when the Union Army crossed to the other side, and then they were lost. You have to understand these people had been broken by slavery. Their heritage was broken, their sense of themselves was broken, and they knew nowhere they were going. So you have a large number of people on one side of the river and the Union Army refusing to take them over the river, leaving them lost there. Now, communities of Black people have been surviving for a long time. So I'll tell you a story. I have, or my father had, a family where he was one of 17 children. His father was a Baptist minister, and he married twice. The first wife gave up and died. That was the best way for her to get out of town. And the second wife finished having the children. So we had all these children on my side of the family. My mother only had 4, and hers were all Irish, so they didn't count. So when we got ready to take a vacation once, Mom and I got in the car and we drove down to the coast of Georgia. Now, on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, there is a phenomenon known as the Sea Islands, which are off the coast. Jekyll Island is off the coast of South Carolina. It's a very popular resort. But we were going to the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia. And when we went there, we met a very strange group of Black people. They had been there for a long time, and their society had not been broken. They remembered who they were, where they came from, and they were still associated as a family group. They spoke a very strange language called Gullah. It's a language that came from Africa, from the Gold Coast area of Africa, of West Africa. And the Gullah knew who they were. They had not lost any sense of their identity. They knew who their brothers and sisters were. They knew their heritage. And so this was very important for them. And they also knew how to grow cotton of a very strange type. The land on the Sea Islands is very rich, dark land. And when you grow cotton there, you get what's called long, stable cotton. And long, stable cotton is a kind of cotton that, for instance, if you happen to have a lot of money and you go to Paris and you go to Chanel, you will find that you have cotton garments made from long, stable cotton. Today you get most of that kind of cotton from Egypt, but in the old days you got it from the Old South. So here are these Gullah and Gullah speakers, and they have left behind the history of who they are. They knew who they were, where they came from, what their religion was. Now, in many cases, as this story goes on, and the rise of communism occurs in Europe, the communists always have felt that this is the place to start a revolution in America, to get the slaves to revolt. But the largest institution that slaves had were their religions. And in their case, it was Southern Baptists and the Southern Methodists who took a very strong interest in converting them. And in that conversion process, they believed very strongly that while this life was not a very pleasant one, they were going to go on to a future where they lived in heaven and it would be better for them. And so they were deeply religious, and you can feel all this when you hear their music. the music of Mahalia Jackson or the music of any number of well-known American black women who sing today. Or if you go down to our dining room, you will see a black man there who often is waiting on tables, is often serving, and he has a very wonderful voice, and occasionally he'll sing for us. And he sings every Sunday in his own black church down in Berkeley, and some of us have gone down there to hear him sing. So you know that these people have a deep religious feeling for where they came from and what they want to see in their life here on earth. And that was always important to the blacks. So the very disappointed leaders of the Communist Party finally gave up because they could find no way of breaking in to this very dispossessed group of people and getting them to revolt. So we'll move along then to the story. Once upon a time, I had a graduate student. Her name was Phyllis Champion. She was a very good grad student. And after our class was over, she called me one day and invited me to lunch. Wanted to know if I'd like to meet somebody interesting. And I said, well, who would it be? And she said it would be Catherine Cleaver. And Catherine's husband was Eldridge Cleaver, one of the most famous black people of the 1960s. So we went, and Catherine was there waiting for us. And we sat down, and I said, well, tell me your story. And she did. She and Eldridge were running away. Running away from whom? The FBI. They were wanted. So they fled together with their children to Cuba, only to find out that Cuba was led by whites, not by blacks. And the blacks were frozen out, so that you had in Cuba the Castro brothers, but they were not very friendly to black people. So they left Cuba and they fled again. This time they fled all the way to an area where we used to see Anise and Rosa, who work for us in the dining room and around the buildings. And it is this country that you call Algeria. And unbeknownst to them, the Algerians do not like black people either. And so they found themselves again escaping to the wrong world. So finally, they did what most revolutionaries in America do, starting with the time of Thomas Jefferson and the Adams and the other groups. They went to Paris. Now, by the time they got to France, Mitterrand was in charge of the French government, and he allowed them to stay. But he said, if you stay, you're not able to demonstrate against America. We will have no troubles from you, and then you will stay as long as you want. And finally, Eldridge and Catherine realized this was no life for them or their children, and so they decided to turn themselves in. So they came back to the United States after 3 years of being exiled, and Eldridge turned himself in and went to jail. He soon got out of jail. To show you how strange America can be, he went to law school. He became a lawyer. And not only did he become a lawyer, he decided to protect little old white ladies who were having a terrible time getting back into their house. We have a lot of people in Berkeley who like to see if they could live maybe in a adult apartment near their children. And they find out it's not going to work and they want to go back in their house as they rented. Well, in Berkeley, you couldn't get back in because the laws favored tenants, not owners. And so here was this black criminal. He had been found guilty, now a lawyer, and now practicing. And he came to the defense of these women, helping them get back into their own house. So it's a very unusual turn of events for this man. But there were other people than Eldridge. There was Huey Newton, because we moved to a period in American history when Black Power and the Black Panthers were a very important part of the process of discussion as to what black people wanted and how they wanted to get it, either by demanding it or working for it. And it became a very difficult time. We came in our time in this country to have a revolution of another sort. With the election of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, we hope to have a follow-on to the New Deal of FDR and the Fair Deal of Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was in many ways fairer than FDR. FDR had a very funny system. He put together a coalition of powerful groups. One were the ethnic groups in the Northeast, the Irish Catholics, the European Jews, and altogether he was able to control the Northeast. And in the South, part of his coalition was the Deep South politicos, and they would have no discussion of their unique institution, referred to in literature as the peculiar institution, meaning slavery. And so while slavery was over officially according to our Constitution and what had happened in the Civil War, we had people lead us in who didn't really understand what it was all about. Abraham Lincoln, for instance, wanted very much to consider the idea that what you do is that you round up the black people and send them back to Africa. Well, Mr. Lincoln, you failed to notice that these people had been here 100 years plus, and they were no longer Africans, they were Americans who happened to be black. And they didn't want to go back to Africa. They wanted to stay here. So what to do? Well, what to do was you had a tremendous internal revolution. The Old South and its leadership had lost, in losing the war, its economic advantage. The planter class was now gone. They had lost their slaves, which was a tremendous investment for them. And so they grow up with a new system. They decide to put in charge an area that allows sharecropping. What this means, if you are a former slave on this plantation, you can go to the owner of the plantation and he will loan you enough money to buy your seeds and the tools that you need, and then you will pay him back by giving him a share of your crop. So the name sharecropper is given to these people. And it became the economic system of the Old South. There was a very famous scholar who was from the South, who went to Yale and taught at Yale for a long time. His name was C. Van Woodward. And his argument in his famous book about the South is that it took the South 100 years to recover from the Civil War. So you have this part of the nation that's really not part of it, but is part of it, but it's falling behind. And in trying to catch up, it took 100 years to get up. What happened, of course, is something no one could predict. By the 1960s, this 100 years is over, something has happened to the Northeast. There has been this Rust Belt created where factories are very old and haven't been retooled, and so they've decided to move south. So the Rust Belt rust in the Northeast, and the new factories move to the south. You can find this very true because we're now a very modern nation, and when you go to Tennessee, you find out the biggest thing happening in Tennessee is the arrival of the Toyota business. Because Toyota wanted to invest in America, not just send us cars. So they built a huge plant in Tennessee. And the governor of Tennessee welcomed them with tax benefits. So they were happy, the workers were happy, but the Northeast had lost. And everywhere you went, if you went to an area called Spartanburg, South Carolina, you found that the biggest activity in town was the movement of the BMW factory had left Germany, and had gone to Spartanburg to build BMWs inside the United States, inside of our tariff walls. And then if you went further down, where we had Alabama, a deep, deep, deep south, you had Mercedes. Mercedes built a huge plant in that area so that Mercedes could be built there. So you have Mercedes, and BMWs, and Toyotas all going to this part of the old South and putting in the newest factories that were very competitive and leaving the Rust Belt to rust. So the country began to change tremendously, and changing in that country were lots of strange things going on. Certainly you remember the time when we had an Irishman, the first time, now we have one again, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The Kennedy brothers knew they had a problem, but they didn't know how to solve it. And soon, of course, in Dallas, it would be all over anyway because Kennedy would be assassinated. But 3 years into his time, and not realizing who he was talking about, he had an appointment with Martin Luther King. And before he had an appointment with him, he had an appointment with Jimmy Baldwin. James Baldwin is an unusual American. He was an incredibly wonderful writer, 3 or 4 rather famous books. But his most famous book is The Storm Next Time. What is The Storm Next Time about, and how does it predict where America is going? The storm next time is the promise that God made to the man called Noah. According to Jimmy Baldwin, God promises that if he destroys the earth again, it will not be by water. It will be fire. And if you believe that, then you had a very strong religious message. Now, what was Baldwin's thinking? Well, I met Jimmy several times, and he's gay, which mainly made him very much not a favorite person of the Black Power movement. He grew up in the horrible areas of Harlem, which is in Manhattan, but not part of the great New York City that I know. And he said in his life, living in Harlem as a black boy, he had 2 choices. He could be either a preacher, like his father had been, and preach the gospel, or he could be a pimp and then run prostitutes. And there was a lot of prostitution in Harlem. So these are the things he saw as his choices. But nevertheless, he came forward to meet the Kennedy brothers. Now, to say that the Kennedys were less than charismatic about this meeting, Bobby announced to his brother John that they were about to see Martin Luther Queen, because it was well known that Jimmy was gay. But they were given a choice now, because Jimmy Baldwin was calling out to the black community for integration, for the blacks and whites to live together in peace and to integrate. And there had already been a sign that this would work, because before there was a Kennedy, and before there were all these other people, there was a wonderful president by the name of Harry Truman. And one of the Harry Truman's greatest gifts was to take the army that he had served in. Harry Truman had been a captain in World War I. And now he was president by accident, then that FDR had died. And he integrated the services. That is, in 1947, he chooses to make the Army, the Navy, and the new Air Force integrated so that blacks and whites would serve together. Now, that doesn't sound much to you today because we have black admirals, we have black generals, but it was a revolution in its day. So this had already happened. And now Baldwin is calling for integration as a way for whites and blacks to live in this country together. And it was very important because in this time there was another man, Muhammad Elijah, who was living in Chicago. And he was calling for separatism, that the only way this would work is to take all the black people and move them to one part of the country and move all the white people out of that part of the country. Separatism. Then we wouldn't have to tolerate each other because there wouldn't be any difference. We would all be white and they'd all be black. And so that was one option, separatism, integration. And there were people who were very divided about these issues. One of them was a man who, I hope she's all right. There's a man who also had strong feelings about this issue. One of the people who were helping were the black Muslims. And in their case, they actually believed in Islam until Malcolm X decided to go to Islam. And when he got there, he realized the Islam that we were having dished out to us here in this country through the black community wasn't anything like the Islam that was practiced by the Islamic people. And so he was very dissuaded, and he came back. Because he spoke now against the Nation of Islam, he was murdered, assassinated. So it's a very convoluted time. You have Baldwin writing his books and writing his famous treatise, The Fire Next Time. You have Elijah Muhammad, and you have the people in Chicago believing that there is a hope for them in the future. So all of this carries us down to today. What are we faced with today? Well, we have a number of black people living with us here in this community in a very peaceful way. But the streets of Oakland are dominated by two features. One is drugs. Drugs are available almost anywhere you go in Oakland, and they destroy black homes left and right. And so it becomes very difficult to be able to work with this. Now, we are going to show you a movie soon, and our film committee has voted. It's called Bodyguard. It's a story of a woman, Whitney Houston, you might know the name, and the very famous film is the only one she made, allows her to go and become well-known, a well-known singer. But when the film is over, the next year she's dead. And she's dead as a very young black woman. And she's dead by an overdose of drugs. Now, people die all the time of overdoses. You can just take too many sleeping pills and end up like Marilyn Monroe. Or you can take heavier drugs and also end up deader than dead. So we have the case of Whitney Houston. We have the case of all the young black people who are killed by violence on the street. And so the question is what to do. And it's a big question for Biden. He watched successfully as Obama tried to deal with these questions. He watched very closely as the very wonderful Michelle Obama tried to deal with some of these questions. And now he himself has a black woman as vice president. I actually much preferred another black woman to to be our vice president. She's from Georgia, and her name is Abrams, and I think she's very good, but I think also Harris will be very good. Now, in the process of doing all these things, I'll tell you another little story. At Berkeley, we had a rather famous black man in the sociology department. His name will go unspoken, but he wrote a book called The Sociology of Sports. The Sociology of Sports. And it was rather notorious. And when the committee from sociology met to consider him for tenure, they voted against tenure for him. And when the next level committee, which is out of also the faculty, called the budget committee, met, they also voted to deny him tenure. Now, it so happens that at this point in time in the history of Berkeley, we had a new chancellor. He'd come from the New York system, and he was trying to hold things together after the terrible 60s at Berkeley. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the 60s was a good time at Berkeley. It was not. So you have this disagreement, and then you have the final deranged decision. There was in the University of California a budget system which meant that we received the budget from Sacramento. And at that time, there was a very famous speaker of the House in Sacramento, and he is a well-known black man who writes a column now in the Chronicle and is well known as having dated Kamala Harris when she was single. And he put a phone call into our chancellor and told the chancellor that if this black sociologist does not get tenure, your budget is in serious trouble. So it was a direct threat. So what to do? Well, the chancellor decided to do the undoable. He awarded tenure to this sociologist at his level, and he went to his highest level possible. No one on the campus had ever gotten tenure that way before, and awarded tenure. Well, the sociology department went crazy. They disliked this decision tremendously, and members of the department decided to leave the department. So you have people like Reinhard Bendix with his wonderful wife, and Reinhard is a symbol of a man who'd suffered. Reinhard was German from Berlin. His father had been a judge in Berlin. His father had fled and gone to British-controlled Palestine, but Reinhard and his wife Jane had went to the University of Chicago, got his PhD, and had come to Berkeley to teach in the sociology department. He was a very famous scholar of Max Weber's work. And now Reinhard decides to leave, and he comes to us in political science and asks to come over, and we say yes. And so we have a transfer from this very difficult problem. We also had Bob Bella, very famous sociologist. He got out of the department by going to the Institute of International Studies and places himself there. So you have the decaying department and this terrible reaction to the fact that this black man did not get tenure. And then the final upset was he left us anyway. Who did he leave us for? A better offer in Harvard? No. He got an offer from the San Francisco 49ers to go and sit on the bench with the 49ers and talk to their $1 million players about a terrible time they were getting from Whitey. And only in America could this happen. There is a football player, let's say, like anyone you want to name, Joe Montana, except Joe isn't black. But there was a black football player, and you're sitting next to this black sociologist now, and you're explaining to him he's getting a real rough time from Whitey, while he, the football player, is making $1 million a year to play football. It sounded like a rather strange situation to most people. But that got the campus settled back again a little bit, and it made it easier for some people to live with a very bad decision where the chancellor himself, a very nice guy, who thought he'd come to a very nice campus, only discovered he was in a hornet's nest of people, because people like Bob Bella were not to be pleased. In fact, I met Bob Bella later. I invited him over to Barbara Bundy's center, and we had there a very foolish man named John Nelson, who wanted to take over Bella's, and wanted then to involve Bella with a student, a University of San Francisco student, who hadn't read his book. And it didn't seem that Nelson had read the book either. So when I drove Bella home that night, he said he was very disappointed in his visit to us because it didn't seem the student, who was inappropriate, had read his book, and he didn't think that the professor, who was John Nelson, had not read the book either. So it was a really unpleasant event for Bob Bella in his one and only visit to the campus at University of San Francisco. So over and over, these things kept broadcasting their way back to the decisions made of what to do with Black Americans in their own country. They were, in many ways, disenfranchised. They had felt strongly about their position in American society. They celebrated very much the election of Obama. But the miracle of Obama didn't solve the problems of all blacks in America. There was a number of problems that just didn't seem to be solved. Let me show you how that can be very difficult. When the planter class, that is those people who had owned the plantations, when they lost the war, the Civil War, and they were dispossessed of their possessions, the black people were very expensive, and they had paid a fortune for them, and now they were free, and they got no money for this freedom, that is, the white people who had owned them. So now the question is what to do when you have these dreadful, we call them in the Old South, the rednecks, coming in to replace what we call the Bourbon aristocracy of the planter class. And the best example of that was incorporated in a film. It's also a part of a very famous novel that was written by a Berkeley student, actually, when he was there. It's the rise of Huey Long. Huey Long became the governor in Louisiana. And Huey Long was nothing but a crook. But he was a clever crook. And before he was finally killed, which he was, because he was sleeping with a doctor's wife, and the doctor seemed to resent it tremendously. And so the doctor went home and got his gun and shot Louis in the State House in Baton Rouge. So if you're going to have a love affair, don't have it with a doctor's wife. So it was that we didn't know what to do, and Huey was an example of what the South had become. Not only was Huey Long the governor, his brother was a senator. So long after Huey was gone, the idea of a senator from the South owned by the old establishment was a time of very difficult, and the South became almost immediately owned by certain very famous families. Even in my state of Virginia, there was the Byrd machine, Senator Byrd, for the longest time, and all the people associated with him ran the state of Virginia. This was true all throughout the South. Senator Russell from the state of Georgia, all of them had their own hooks in, and all of them still tried to remain faithful to the FDR coalition. The FDR way of running things was to divide the country, between three. You have the South as a block, you have the Northeast as a block, and you have the Middle West as a block, and that was enough to put the country together. And it happened that it worked for a while. But even there were cracks. For instance, you have a odd institution in America. We actually believe we are a government of men and women, but we're actually a government of law. But the men and women do matter. So we have a very good black university, several of them, Tuskegee, and we have very good people graduating. One of the universities that's mainly black is Howard University. It's in the state, or it's in the city of Washington, D.C., and they have a very marvelous man graduate, and he became nominated and won the nomination to be a Supreme Court justice. That's Thurgood Marshall. So you have your first black member of the court. You're going to, again, have very odd people coming up. Ronald Reagan is going to nominate the first woman to be a Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. You're going to get these done over and over again. Even early in the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson nominated a person who was very good to be the first Jewish member of the court. And so the court began to change. And as that changed, so many things in America changed too. But it takes time. And also there are very, shall we say, conservative judges who feel very differently. For instance, the judges that we've had recently have mainly been Roman Catholics. Alito, rather. And this matters tremendously to a large number of women, because it's possible that the very controversial decision, Roe versus Wade, could be overturned. Now that might not bother you if you're a man, but it certainly would bother a lot of women who feel like Roe versus Wade is, if they needed it, a fallback position. You don't have to have an abortion to know that there is a possibility that if in some crisis you would go to have that done. I can remember my mother telling us, my brother and I, that a very good friend of hers needed very badly to have this abortion done. And my mother went with her to a very large city on the coast of Virginia called Norfolk, Virginia. And it was a back alley kind of abortion from which you could easily die, because it was done on the worst of conditions. So you have the courts now involving themselves in all the great decisions of black life. And for them, the one that really mattered was a decision by a governor of the state of California. He was a Republican, rather conservative. His papers are at the University of California, Berkeley Library, so I always have my student go over there and look it up, and look up one of the things that he had denounced. Warren thought it was a terrible thing that all these women, that means all of you who are women, during the war had left the home and gone to work. You'd become Rosie the Riveter over at the shipyards. You'd taken on all these jobs, and Warren thought the best thing that had happened to this country was, as soon as the war was over, for all these women to go back to the house, go back to their home, back to raising children, back to cooking and cleaning. In other words, being housewives was an ambitious goal for all women in this country. Well, not all women felt that way, but Warren did. So who would suspect that in the great debate where he betrayed, there was a wonderful senator, Senator Taft, from the state of Ohio, who appeared to be Mr. Republican, and he was the next supposed nominee of the Republican Party. And the forces that were there for Eisenhower came to Warren and said, if you swing the state of California into our column for Eisenhower, we will give you what you want, which is supposedly an appointment on the court. And Warren did that. And the state of California tipped in the direction of Eisenhower, and then the payback came. Now, initially, when Warren called the White House to want his appointment, they became very nervous, and they said, well, you know, the only thing that's open now is the Chief Justice, and we didn't promise you that, so we'll have to wait. And he said, no, I'll take Chief Justice. And so he got his I forgot to make my announcement of no cell phones. So Warren said, no, you promised me, and I want that, and now the fur was in the fat was in the fire because they didn't want him to go public. So finally, Warren became Chief Justice with no problem. He'd sit there, supposedly be very conservative, and that's not what happened. The Warren Court became the most active court in the nation's history, and they finally gave us the final decision. If Truman had integrated the American armed forces so that there was no separation of races, now the Warren Court was going to integrate the school system of the United States of America, and you are not going to have separate but equal. Now you have to understand this had been tested before. In 1890, long before any of these people were alive, the court had had a decision to face, and they had, in Plessy versus Ferguson, agreed that the school system that was segregated was separate but equal, and that was good, and there was no problem with it. And so separate but equal was the law of the land. Now, in the 1960s, this court was doing what it seldom ever does. It was overruling a former decision of the court and declaring that separate but equal would no longer be, and we would have a desegregated. And this was very, very important to lots of people. I went to school in those days. I went to the College of William and Mary, for instance. We didn't have a black person going to that college. It was a totally white college. I went to high school, and my high school was very much, they went to theirs and we went to ours. And now suddenly you were going to integrate them all, and they would all be in a school together depending on the district. And it caused bedlam in this country. To get this done rapidly, a decision was made that you would bus children from one school area to another in order to get enough of a mix of black and white. So families are now furious about the busing issue. They were furious about integration to begin with, and it was a very difficult decade, a decade long. In fact, if you remember anything about this last political convention we had, in which there was, in fact, a very unfair challenge, and I think unfair of her to even raise the question when Harris said of Biden that he was part of something that she had to suffer because she was a little black girl who had to go across town to school, when in fact the truth was a very different truth. But nevertheless, there's no use digging up the past. The process is one that this whole business is very difficult, and very difficult for black people today. And they often see their leaders and their people who sort of stand out in their community then dead later. And it's not just one person who dies. You know, we lived in that terrible time of first the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, then the death of Robert Kennedy in LA, and then the death of the great black man himself, who had before gone to the Lincoln Monument and said something about the destiny of all people, and now he was dead, shot to death in a Memphis hotel. So what were we going to do with all these things? Well, we were going to add them up and try to make sense of the fact that black people in this country had gotten a raw deal and that they needed very much a helping hand. Now, occasionally the helping hand comes from the strangest place. In the beginning of this 20th century that we just lived through, a man came to be president by accident again. They'd shot somebody, better known as McKinley. And McKinley then, according to this man named Hanna, who ran the Republican Party, who was a senator, he said, "Oh, God, no. Now we're stuck with that terrible cowboy." Because the man who became president of the United States was Teddy Roosevelt. And one of the first things Teddy did was really amazing. He looked around him and he said, "I'm going to invite Booker T. Washington, a major figure in the black community, to come to the White House for dinner." Actually ended up being a working sort of brunch, lunch, breakfast. But the important thing was that Teddy Roosevelt was sending out a signal to America at the beginning of the 20th century that we had to find a place for everyone in this country, and we would do so by leadership at the top. I, President of the United States, will have this black man come, and also we will talk together. And one of the things we will talk about is education, because Booker T. Washington wasn't looking for a handout. He wanted to build colleges and schools for black people to go to so that they could make their own way in life, and they did. We train them now today, and the best example, of course, is Tuskegee itself, the university. You know, later that a lot of those men who went to Tuskegee flew for the United States in World War II. And not only did they fly, they flew together as a Tuskegee group of airmen who became rather famous and very highly decorated group of airmen flying for their country in a time of a very, very bad and difficult war. And so it was, whether it was Teddy Roosevelt at his end of the century or Barack Obama at his, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was some hope that we would get that done. And of course, we began to get it done when, of all people, the strangest president that we had ever had, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was again a president by accident. Kennedy was shot, Johnson was president, and Johnson leads his nation into the Great Society. And one of the Great Society claims was to have a civil rights movement. And by then, civil rights was being demanded across the United States, particularly by large groups, and particularly at Berkeley by students who were rioting on campus, demanding these things. And the Civil Rights Bill that passed was a major piece of legislation that tried to put the thing together again in a way that made black people happy and made the system work as far as they were concerned. And so it goes around the long corner for many Americans who live through the Great Society plans, the plans of Johnson, and the Barack Obama lifetime. And now we are with a turning point. That turning point is what is President today going to do to help? And one of the ways he can was to try and make it possible for blacks to find a way to celebrate their own nature in this country. And I think I've just looked at the clock and we've come to a finishing point. So thank you very much for coming today.